And we are, as a people, inherently and historically
Wake up.
opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
The show that asks questions about why we don't ask questions.
What the hell is going on?
This is Conspiracy Queries with Alan Park. Welcome to Conspiracy Queries with Alan Park. These are Conspiracy Queries, and I am Alan Park. We are closing out November as the 50th anniversary. Not something to get excited about, but something to definitely recognize and consider the importance of the 50th anniversary of the assassination of JFK. We've had a few shows on that topic this month, and for that reason, I am unapologetic. I don't think we really have the full story, even when you combine all of the stories that are out there. And I think it's very important that we keep looking, because the underbelly of what happened on that day, I believe, still exists. The seamy, dark, criminal, vile, hated people that put this kind of nonsense together, where they have to use crime and death and killing and manipulation and step outside of the decency that we should all be able to access as human beings. So anyhow, with that end in mind, I have with me today the author Roger Stone, and his book featured is The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. Yes, that's right, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the vice president, gets a pretty bad rap in this book. Roger Stone is a political consultant, has worked many hours and years in the White House itself, and he has gathered some documents together, as well as using firsthand knowledge and contacts to prove in his book that LBJ was possibly even the mastermind of JFK's takedown. I hope you're ready for winter, regardless of where you are in the world. We've just had a horrible disaster strike the Philippines, and weather is out of control now. There's no saying what it's going to do. I know that we are spending a little bit of time controlling it, figuring it out, and I don't understand why people think that, saying something like you can control the weather is outrageous. But then when it was in the mainstream press that for the Olympics and to get prepared for it, China controlled the weather, no one seemed to have a problem with that. Very selective where we apply our branches from the knowledge tree. Also want to say quickly that several major countries have signed a deal to help avoid a nuclear meltdown in the center of the planet with Iran. And Iran is going to allow inspectors and various other terms. And, of course, there's a couple of countries not too happy about that. Number one, Israel, and number two, Canada, not lining up with the United States, the UK, France, Germany, those rabble-rousers. So I think that's a bit of a mistake on Canada's part. But what else is new? We've got that same idiotic government we've always had, or it seems like it, for the last 112 years. Hopefully we'll get out of that pickle. But we don't have much more time to spend on that. Let's say we go to our interview. And here we are with Roger Stone, the author of the new book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy. Talk about pinning it down to one man. There are a lot of different Kennedy interpretations, Kennedy assassination theories, and as you know, we've been spending most of November on the show discussing this because it is a very important seminal moment in history, and I didn't realize I'd be so overwhelmed by the quality and amount of books on the assassination, and this one is, as I say, The Man Who Killed Kennedy. The author is Roger Stone. He's with us now. Roger, how are you today?
Excellent. Great to be with you.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on. Can you tell the folks a little bit about your background? Sometimes a guy will write a book and, you know, what business is it of his, people would think. But you've got a pretty steeped political career yourself.
Yeah, I've been active in American politics for 40 years, really since my teenage days. I have worked for 3 American presidents, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. I'm a veteran political operative. At the same time, my book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ, I think anyone who reads it will see that it is not a partisan book. I'm pretty rough on the Kennedys. I'm pretty rough on Johnson, obviously, but I'm also equally rough on Arlen Specter, George Bush, Gerald Ford, a number of other Republicans. This is kind of a warts-and-all book by a political realist, if you will. I've seen a lot and heard a lot of things in 40 years, and I don't allege that LBJ alone or LBJ and his circle killed John Kennedy. I argue that he was the linchpin of a plot that, yes, included the CIA, yes, included the mob, yes, included big Texas oil, but because Dallas is the single most important aspect of the murder, I think Johnson is the indispensable man, and he was also the man with the greatest amount to gain and also the most to lose. In November of 1963, Johnson was not only facing being dumped from the 64 National Democratic ticket, he was looking at being prosecuted for corruption and sent to prison.
Now, let's spend a little bit of time on that, because that's something that doesn't really come up as much when we look back on those years and the results from the assassination. Obviously, what he stood to gain was to become president, but can you spend a little more time telling us what he had going against him, the trouble that he was in, and why wouldn't he get on the ticket in 64?
Well, he'd become a liability because of all of the bad press that he was getting surrounding 2 major scandals in which he was jammed up. The Bobby Baker scandal. Bobby Baker is the Secretary of the U.S. Senate and essentially Johnson's bagman. Baker has accepted millions of dollars in bribes on behalf of Lyndon Johnson. And he was also embroiled in the Billy Sol Estes scandal. Billy Sol Estes was a flamboyant Texas wheeler-dealer con man, and he and Johnson have looted massive multi-million-dollar federal contracts that Johnson has used his influence to deliver for Sol Estes. In 1964, Robert Kennedy is the U.S. Attorney General, and he is leaking information to the U.S. Senate committee investigating Baker, and he is leading an investigation into Sol Estes, and in fact is leaking that information to Life magazine, the Time Life Corporation. In fact, Life magazine in November of 1963 has a SWAT team of 9 full-time investigative reporters on the ground in Texas, and lo and behold, they find out that Lyndon Johnson's worth $25 million. Yet he's been on the public payroll his entire life. School teacher, congressman, U.S. senator. So Johnson is not only facing being dumped. In fact, John F. Kennedy, according to her memoirs, John F. Kennedy tells Evelyn Lincoln, his personal secretary, on the eve of leaving for Dallas, that Johnson will not be on the 64 ticket, that he's become too much of a liability. He can no longer deliver Texas. And he says, quote, "I don't know who it will be, but it won't be Lyndon." So it's not just political defeat that Johnson is facing. It's public humiliation and the federal penitentiary, jail. And that makes Johnson a very, very desperate man.
Right. And so in the grand scheme of things, how does he position himself, or who was positioning him to be the linchpin, as you say, for that day?
Well, I think he's the driving force of the plot, and he's the guy with the most immediate problems, but he doesn't have any trouble finding, I hate this word, but co-conspirators. The CIA is furious with JFK because in 1960, Kennedy has run to the right of Nixon as an unabashed cold warrior, a hardline anti-communist, yet when push comes to shove in the Bay of Pigs operation, He fails to order the air support for the Cuban rebels who are storming the beach, and the CIA is furious about that. The CIA Bay of Pigs operation turns out to be a fiasco in which the rebels are routed, hundreds killed, hundreds more captured. They're also furious about the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've been told that the Kennedys faced down the Russians and that the Russians blinked. But in fact, 40 years after the fact, we find out the truth, which is John Kennedy made a Boston-style backroom deal. We removed our missiles from the European theater. We removed U.S. strategically placed missiles from Italy and Turkey in return for a pledge from the Soviets to remove their missiles from Cuba. Now, the agreement between Khrushchev and Kennedy doesn't include any neutral third-party inspection, so we have no proof that the Russian missiles were ever actually removed. This was all kept from the American people for almost 40 years. Mm-hmm. We were told this myth that that Kennedy faced them down and the Russians blinked. That's simply not true.
Mm.
So I guess the point here is the CIA has motive. Then there's organized crime. The mob has given John F. Kennedy $1 million towards the 1960 election. They have stolen votes for him in the city of Chicago and in West Virginia and in Texas. And in return, Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy, President Kennedy's father, who was a gangster himself, a man who made his fortune in bootlegging by partnering with the New York gangster Frank Costello, bringing liquor in by boat into Cape Cod in Massachusetts and then trucking it down to New York for sale during Prohibition. Joe Kennedy has assured the mob that in return for their money and their voter intimidation activities that the deportation proceedings against Carlos Marcello and Santo Traficante Jr., two of the major mob leaders of the day, will be ended. In fact, after JFK is elected and Robert Kennedy becomes Attorney General, he steps up the war on organized crime. He puts wiretaps on Marcello and Traficante. He harasses them with 24-hour surveillance, and he speeds up deportation process against them both. So they feel double-crossed, thus their motive. And then lastly, there's Big Texas Oil. They're apoplectic because Kennedy has proposed repealing their sweetheart tax breaks, the oil depletion allowance, which saves them hundreds of millions of dollars in tax payments to the U.S. government. Now, I think it's important to note that Lyndon Johnson has a unique relationship with each one of them. Johnson is the appropriator for the CIA. Johnson, through the 50s, has presided over the humongous growth of the CIA's secret budgets. Johnson actually sits on the subcommittee, the aerospace subcommittee, where the black box budgets, the secret budgets of the CIA are tucked into the appropriations. So he has delivered a huge amount of cash for them. As far as the mob is concerned, the mob is bribing Lyndon Johnson. They're paying him $55,000 a year, an astronomical sum in 1960 in the 50s, in return for protection of their illegal gambling operations in Texas from the U.S. attorneys in Houston and Dallas, San Antonio. In fact, we know for a fact that as soon as Johnson becomes president, he orders a termination of all the Justice Department wiretaps on organized crime figures put in place by Robert Kennedy.
That was the first thing he did?
Johnson, yes, he did it the Monday after he became president. He also, as you probably know, reversed an executive order which Kennedy had signed to begin the withdrawal of American advisors from Vietnam in the same time frame. So, which interestingly enough is an executive order that JFK has signed just before leaving for Dallas.
Right.
Johnson reverses that. So he gives the Pentagon and the defense contractors their war. It's important to note that Johnson and his wife are major stockholders in Brown and Root, later known as Halliburton, and also in Bell Helicopter, all of whom would receive multi-million-dollar contracts for defense contracts for the Vietnam War.
And wasn't the
So
founder
Johnson
of Bell
and his wife actually profit from the Vietnam War directly.
And wasn't the founder of Bell Helicopter, I read somewhere, that he was actually found guilty at Nuremberg and supposed to die, and somehow manages to get back to the United States and form that company?
You know, I'm not familiar with that, but it's an interesting twist. It's something I'll have to look into. I have not heard that before.
Yeah. All right. Now, you were speaking earlier about before the assassination, obviously, and LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and you write that he had ties to at least 7 politically motivated murders prior to the death of John Kennedy. Can you tell us a bit about those? I guess that would have been going on while he was a very high-up operative or a government agent.
Yes. Basically, Johnson steals the 1948 Senate election. So 200 non-existent voters vote after the polls are closed, and Johnson wins by 86 votes. That's 1948.
Right.
In 1952, a man named Sam Southwick, who was a deputy sheriff, agrees to testify against Johnson in the voter fraud. Within hours of him agreeing to testify for the Justice Department, he's murdered in prison. I think that's the beginning of, or near the beginning of Johnson's killing streak.
Mm-hmm.
In 1951, a man named John Douglas Kinzer, is intimately involved with Johnson's sister. Johnson's sister is a bohemian, bisexual party girl and sometime prostitute. And Kinzer is trying to blackmail Johnson, demanding money, trying to put the bite on Johnson. He won't quit. So a man named Malcolm Wallace, who works for the U.S. Agriculture Department in a patronage job, a man who is a Marine Corps veteran, has the highest ranking that the Marine Corps awards to shooters. He is an expert, whereas Lee Harvey Oswald is merely a marksman. That's the lowest grade, by the way, that the Marine Corps bestows to a shooter. And our friend Wallace, who is serving in a job arranged for him by Johnson at the U.S. Agriculture Department, finds Kinzer in Austin, Texas, and blows him away in broad daylight in front of witnesses. He flees.
Wow.
He is apprehended by the Austin police. When he's arrested, according to a sworn affidavit by the arresting officer, he says, "You can't arrest me. I have to get back to Washington. I work for Senator Johnson." He is indicted for first-degree murder. He's bailed out by 2 of Johnson's largest financial supporters. He's represented at trial by Lyndon Johnson's personal attorney, John Kofer, and he's convicted of first-degree murder, whereupon he gets a 5-year suspended sentence and walks out of court a free man. He is immediately hired by Temco, a defense contractor owned by Johnson's financial supporter, D.H. Byrd. And interestingly, D.H. Byrd is also the man who owns the Texas School Book Depository building. Interestingly enough, Wallace, who's now a convicted murderer, gets a full security clearance from the U.S. government while working for Temco. When the Texas Rangers investigate how that comes about, they learn that Vice President Lyndon Johnson has arranged the security clearance for Malcolm Wallace. Now, let's go to 1963. Malcolm Wallace leaves a perfect 34-point match fingerprint in the 6th floor in the sniper's nest in the Texas School Book Depository building. It is the indelible tie between the murder and Lyndon Johnson. Also, 6 witnesses tell either the Dallas Police Department or the Warren Commission that they see movement. They see at least 2 men in the windows of the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building shortly before the shooting. One witness, Richard Carr, says that he actually saw a man who meets Mac Wallace's description, heavy-set, balding, horn-rimmed spectacles, not only in the 6th floor shooter's window, but sees him flee the building moments after the shooting. 2 other witnesses identify a man who meets the description of Wallace. A fellow who saw him not only in the window but flee, his name is Richard Carr, is no less than 4 attempts on his life after he tells the Dallas police this. There's an attempt to shoot him in Texas. He moves to Montana after getting threatened. There's an attempt to kill him in Montana. He finds dynamite strapped to the ignition of his car. When he is called to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978, there are 2 more attempts on his life. Unfortunately, he was quicker on the draw than the 2 men who tried to kill him, and he ended up killing one of them. So one has to wonder, what was it that Richard Carr saw that was so damaging that there are so many attempts on his life?
I have no idea. I wasn't there. And I don't like that your tone accusing me of my complicity here, Roger. I thought this was just going to be a straight up interview. All right.
Yeah,
well,
it was a rhetorical question.
I know. I just had to jump in there and say that. I'd like to move on to just a little bit off topic for a second, if we may. In your background, it lists that you played a crucial role in the recount that made George W. Bush the president. Tell us a little bit about that, because I want people to get a sense of your current day political maneuverings as well.
Yeah, I obviously a longtime Republican political operative and had a longtime friendship with James A. Baker III, who was our Secretary of State, but also managed the recount process. The Democrats in Miami-Dade County wanted to recount the same batch of votes 3 times. They had already been counted twice without any change. They were moving to count them a 3rd time, seeking to manufacture additional votes to put Al Gore across in a recount. And I helped persuade the Miami-Dade County commissioners not to recount a 3rd time. Also, at some point in the middle of that recount, 2 Democratic officials grab a sheaf of ballots and seek to go behind closed doors with no windows and no third-party independent monitors with the ballots, in my opinion, in an attempt to alter them. That violates Florida's sunshine laws. That's against the law. So, yes, I instructed people to break down that door.
Well, it seems like there's a thread of corruption and illegality going on through elections from at least your experience with George Bush there all the way back to Kennedy and probably before that. We're going to just take a quick break, and we're with Roger Stone, who has written the book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. We'll be right back. So going back to the assassination of Kennedy and LBJ's role in it, do you suggest that there were, you said earlier that, yes, the CIA was involved and the mob was involved, but was there some sort of cohesive, overarching intelligence committee that sort of organized these things, or were some far more complicit than others who were just happy to benefit from this politically charged?
I think there's a distinction between those who were in on the plot and those who knew about it and would benefit and did nothing. You know, there's a Latin saying, cui prodest seclus est fict. The person who derives the greatest benefit from the crime is the person who committed it. In this case, I think that the murder of John Kennedy was 2 years in the planning. In fact, Johnson's blackmailed his way on the ticket in 1960. The truth is that John Kennedy had already selected Senator Stuart Symington for vice president. He'd asked Symington to join him on the ticket, and Symington had agreed. Symington was drafting his acceptance speech when Lyndon Johnson came to John Kennedy's hotel room in Los Angeles at the Democratic Convention late at night, and he had with him a file on Kennedy's sex life. The file had been provided by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover has his own motives. He knows that the Kennedys intend to retire him, to force him into mandatory retirement at age 70, which would have been 1964, a year after the assassination. He also is a next-door neighbor of Lyndon Johnson in Northwest Washington, a longtime ally of Johnson's. Indeed, the FBI budget has tripled from 1951 to 1963 through the good graces of Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Baines Johnson. Hoover is kind of well known as a Kennedy hater. And essentially, Johnson says, you need me, you need Texas, and more importantly, if you don't put me on the ticket, I'm going to take this dossier and give it to Dick Nixon. remembering that Nixon is locked in a very close general election with John Kennedy, skin tight, the closest election in American history, I think, until 2000.
Mm-hmm.
And Robert Kennedy is not present, and Robert Kennedy is furious. The others who are supported John Kennedy for the Democratic nomination, the African American community, labor, the party liberals, they're furious. Lyndon Johnson is a lifelong segregationist. He has personally killed every major and minor piece of civil rights legislation through the 50s and into the early 60s, with the exception of the 1957 Civil Rights Bill. And in that case, Johnson dropped a poison pill into the legislation that required that anyone who violated that law would be tried before a state jury, not a federal jury. And there is no jury of white men in Mississippi who is going to convict a white man of a crime against a black man or a black person. And Johnson knows it. So he guts the law, although tries to benefit from the symbolism of it. I think he lets the 1957 Act pass to try to burnish his credentials for the 1960 presidential nomination. So Robert Kennedy, of course, deeply resents Johnson. They have a war, which I think explains why Robert Kennedy was trying to dump him from the 64 ticket.
Mm-hmm. That would make sense. Then later, of course, Senator Robert Kennedy, at some point, and it's kind of amazing, it took as long as it did, but he obviously wanted to investigate more fully JFK's death. And you make the case that that's what brought RFK down.
That is my belief. In other words, Robert Kennedy is a political realist. People say to me, well, if he knew all this, why didn't he do anything about it? Who's he going to complain to? The FBI and J. Edgar Hoover? The Secret Service? The Justice Department? Those are all now controlled by President Lyndon Johnson. Although Robert Kennedy continues to hold the title of Attorney General, Johnson begins dealing with the number two there, Nicholas de Katzenbach. We've seen memos that he wrote that were declassified in the 1990s, in which he basically says, even before the Warren Commission results, we have to come up with a cover story to end all this discussion of conspiracy. So I think Kennedy knows that he is politically blocked, and the only way he will ultimately get the truth about his brother's death is to become president himself. Through the mid-1960s, he kind of weakly says that he is supports the Warren Commission conclusions, and then to the surprise of everyone, shortly before the California primary, while he is campaigning in California, according to his press secretary, Frank Mankiewicz, who has been a friend of mine of 35, 40 years, Mankiewicz confirms that Robert Kennedy said, everyone's surprised, yes, he would reopen the investigation into his brother's death. And that, I think, is what precipitates his murder only 4 days later.
Mm-hmm. With a whole other conspiratorial undertones that have never really fully been resolved.
Yeah, no, that's a book in itself, and I don't profess to know as much about his assassination other than the fact that I think there's enough research now to indicate multiple shooters and a botched job by the Los Angeles Police Department. The other thing I find interesting, of course, is that in the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King, we know that just days before his murder, an FBI wiretap monitoring the conversations of Dr. King and one of his political associates, King says that he's decided to support Robert Kennedy for the 1968 presidential nomination. This is just before Kennedy says he's going to reopen the investigation. 9 days later, King is also dead. So, yes, I think there is a connection between these three murders. And I think that's another book for another day, but it's one that I'm interested in writing.
So is this a multi-headed hydra, this organization of people that are able to just, let's just say, whack these highly powerful political influential figures? And if so, I mean, they seem to be able to organize and carry out these assassinations and then move on. Is that entity, be it comprised of the mob and the CIA and perhaps the DOD or whoever's involved in this, is this something that we are dealing with today as well in the shadows and don't really know it?
Presumably. I mean, I think it is more a loose confederation in which everybody involved in the plot has their own motives, but their motives coincide. So as I have moved around the country promoting this book, the question that I get most often is, why would the Warren Commission, why would these learned and respected men who had served their country, why would they go along with the cover-up? I think the answer is simple. We find it in Earl Warren's memoirs. Lyndon Johnson told him a bald-faced lie. The Russians killed John Kennedy. Oswald was a communist, but he really worked for Russia. We have to conceal this from the American people. Otherwise, it will mean World War III, nuclear holocaust. Millions will die. You know, Judge Warren, Justice Warren, you must help us cover this up. You have to do your patriotic duty. Johnson tells the exact same lie to Senator Richard Russell, a member of the Warren Commission. I think he tells the same lie to Congressman Gerald Ford. There's no evidence whatsoever that the Russian state or the Cubans were involved in the assassination of Kennedy. It's a myth. Ironically, it's a myth that Secretary of State John Kerry repeated only 10 days ago.
Well, I think they get a lot of traction out of that because he was there. He did go there prior to, as part of a defector.
Yes, and he returned, and he denounced his citizenship. He renounced his citizenship, and he returned to the United States, and he got his citizenship back without applying for it. Why? How did that happen? That doesn't happen. We also know that the United States government paid for his return flights and the flight of his family, and they lent him $5,000, an astronomical sum, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. So we now have testimony of at least three major CIA figures: Victor Marchetti, who was a deputy director of the CIA, Robert Plumley, who was a CIA operative. Both say that Oswald was a U.S. intelligence asset, that he was trained in a defector program in Nags Head, North Carolina, that his background as a communist is largely fabricated by the agency. I think that Oswald is exactly what he says he is. He's a patsy. So while Malcolm Wallace is on the 6th floor shooting at least one of the shooters at John F. Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald is on the 2nd floor eating his lunch. We know that he is found by a police officer in the 2nd floor lunchroom 75 seconds after Kennedy's been shot. The government claims that he ran down 4 flights of stairs to be there, but he's not out of breath, he's not upset, he's not nonplussed, he doesn't seem to know what's going on. And now we have the testimony of several women who were on the staircase at the exact time in question. One of them wrote a letter to the Warren Commission. They didn't see Lee Harvey Oswald. More importantly, on a wooden staircase built in the 1920s, they didn't hear Lee Harvey Oswald. That's because he's not on the staircase. He didn't go down the elevator because the electricity was turned off and the elevators were not operating. There's no dispute about that. So I think Oswald is what he says he is. He's a patsy. He's a fall guy. The CIA has fabricated his background. They've moved him into place. Again, I think this whole operation took 2 years in the planning. It's interesting to me that when Lyndon Johnson is selected for vice president in 1960, he's asked the next morning by a reporter, why would you give up one of the most powerful jobs in Washington, Senate Majority Leader, to be vice president of the United States, a job with no power whatsoever? And Johnson's candid. He says 1 in 4 vice presidents are elevated to the presidency when the president dies, and he likes his odds.
Wow.
Maybe that's why Bobby Baker, the Secretary of the Senate, says, according to Senate testimony at the 1961 inauguration of John Kennedy, a very cold day in January 1961, when Kennedy gives his famous "Ask not what you can do for your country" speech, Baker says John F. Kennedy will not live out his term, and he will die a violent death. That's 1961, 3 years before the assassination.
Sorry, who said that again?
Bobby Baker, Secretary of the U.S. Senate, a man Lyndon Johnson has described as, quote, my strong right arm.
That's pretty damning. And does any of this information show up in the Warren Commission, even the broader report?
No. But in my book, I'm very heavily annotated and footnoted and documented on my sources. So that attribution to Baker comes from Senate sworn testimony by Don Reynolds, who was an aide to Lyndon Johnson and who was subpoenaed by the Senate in the investigation into Bobby Baker. Testimony was actually given on November 22nd, 1963. The Senate hearings into the Baker-Johnson corruption actually opened in Washington the actual day of the assassination.
Wow. Let's talk a little bit about Fat Tony Salerno, who you spoke with. And
yes.
he says that himself and Carlos Marcello, the other infamous mobster, had worked with the CIA to kill Kennedy. And what kind of information did they have that made you believe that, and that, as they claimed, that LBJ was behind the plot?
Well, first of all, it's important to recognize that Clint Murchison, who is a major right-wing Texas oil man and a financial supporter of Lyndon Johnson's, is partners with the Genovese crime family in a number of legitimate businesses and illegitimate businesses. And Fat Tony Salerno, by the time I met him in 1979, is the acting head of the Genovese crime family. I had the opportunity to meet him in New York City. It was just totally serendipitous. And I was working for Ronald Reagan and was introduced to him, and he told me he was sour on politics. He really wasn't looking at getting involved in the 1980 race in any way. Because in 1960 he was still bitter. He said, we delivered for John Kennedy and we got double-crossed. I couldn't resist the opportunity to ask him who killed Kennedy, and he just laughed and said it was Carlos Marcello, the agency, and Lyndon. He is deceased at this time, but it was a confirmation of what the House Select Committee on Assassinations said in their final report. They actually had wiretaps on both Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante. You can read the transcripts. Both of them admit that they knew in advance that Kennedy was going to be killed, and that in their view he had it coming. Stunning transcripts, which the government made public. And in 1978, the final report of the House Select Committee of the Congress on Assassinations concluded that indeed Kennedy was killed on the basis of a conspiracy, that Oswald didn't act alone, and that organized crime was involved. And they offer the wiretaps on Marcello and Trafficante as further proof.
Right. Well, that's incredible, because it doesn't I just wanted to ask you quickly, we have to take a quick break, but most people nowadays believe that the official story of one man killing JFK is pretty ridiculous, but there are a percentage of people that actually still do believe it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, in 1963, there were only 3 television networks, and therefore, if they didn't say something, it didn't happen. And therefore, I think the original imprimatur of the lone nut gunman was laid down by the mass media of the day. Over time, thanks to the invention of cable TV and talk radio and the Internet, the people can get information from alternative sources now. It's not just ABC, CBS, and NBC. Now you've got 100 sources where you can go for alternative information, and therefore the government's case has fallen apart over time. In all honesty, I don't see how anyone with any basic intelligence or objectivity can believe in this day and age that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone nut acting alone, that there was no conspiracy. The preponderance of evidence is exactly the opposite. But even today, the 3 major networks and CNN continue to promulgate the myth that Oswald killed Kennedy. And okay, maybe there was a conspiracy, but he was working for the Russians. There's just no evidence of that, none whatsoever. I would challenge anyone to come up with some proof. In fact, if you look at the things that both Castro and Khrushchev say in the wake of the assassination, the evidence is to the contrary. We know that Ambassador William Atwood, who had gone to Princeton with JFK, I think he was his roommate, had the instructions of Kennedy, circumvented the CIA and reached out to Castro to explore back-channel talks to try to normalize relationships with Cuba. And although Castro was reportedly surprised, he was interested. He has we also know a French journalist who was friendly with Jackie Kennedy, was empowered by Kennedy to talk to Castro behind the CIA's back to see if he was interested in opening a dialogue. So I don't think he has any motive in 1963. Khrushchev has just taken Kennedy, the green Mr. Kennedy, to the cleaners in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Why would he want to replace him? He's just triumphed over him.
All right, well, we're gonna take a quick break. We're with Roger Stone. He's authored the book "The Man Who Killed Kennedy: The Case Against LBJ." We'll be right back. And right back we are with Roger Stone. Roger's book is Roger. You've been all over the place. I want to make sure that I include your upcoming appearance at the Buffalo Talking Leaves. When is that going to happen?
That is, I think, the 6th of December. So I'm in Buffalo the 5th and the 6th. I'm at the Wyndham in Amherst, New York, actually Williamstown, New York, on the 5th. And then I am at the Talking Leaves in Buffalo on the 6th. And then on December 3rd, prior to that, I'm actually in Palm Beach for any snowbirds you may have listening.
Well, I bet we do. So that's where you can see Roger. He's got this book. You can buy one. He will sign it for you, and maybe you can ask him a few questions that you wished I was asking him right now. But we only have an hour, so I'm doing the best I can. The oil men. Let's get into that a little bit. I want to spend some time with the oil men in and around Lyndon's reign, his roots originally, his southern ties, and I want to spend some time a little bit, as we touched on it earlier, cui bono, who benefits, but let's spend a little bit of time with the oil scene back then. They seem to be just as rampant these days as they must have been back then.
Well, but before, I'd be remiss if I didn't say you could buy the book on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com, or you can go to LBJKilledJFK.com and buy it there. It's doing very well, despite the fact that some in the mainstream media choose to ignore it. I'm not holding my breath for a New York Times review, for example.
Yeah, let's go there for a second. Well, let's jump in and say, well, how has it been going with mainstream? Is anyone interested in putting this type of information out?
The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Huffington Post have chosen to ignore me, but Fox has given the book substantial coverage, as has a number of websites. You know, in the Internet age, thank goodness, radio and the Internet probably sell more books than television, but I've been on with Sean Hannity, I've been on with Glenn Beck, I've been on with Larry King, and I'm gratified. I've gotten plenty of coverage, so I really have no complaint. Ironically, I was booked to be on CNN on both their show Crossfire and their show Aaron Burnett. They even bought my tickets to come to Washington for the taping. And then under pressure from the taxpayer-supported LBJ library, specifically a man named Tom Johnson, who was a former CNN executive now on the library board, they folded. That's censorship. That's Soviet-style censorship. In other words, you don't have to believe my book. It's up to you. Read it. If you don't like it, that's fine. If you do like it, that's great too. But to say, oh, don't read this book, you know, that sounds like Nazi Germany to me. The people should be able to decide on their own. So this guy, Tom Johnson, calls himself a journalist? No, he's a thug.
He's the opposite of that. That's for sure. Okay, well, let's take us back to the 50s and the 60s and the Texas oil scene. What was going on there? Why is that important?
Well, Texas Oil is a major funder of Johnson's entire political career. The oil depletion allowance is the tax break that allows them to write off hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes. And, of course, they are a major factor in Texas politics and have funded the career of Lyndon Johnson, starting with his House race and then going into his ultimate election to the Senate in 1948. It's interesting to note that Kennedy was trying to repeal the oil depletion allowance then. Later on, in 1973, 74, even Nixon's Treasury Department was looking at trying to repeal the oil depletion allowance. Yet it has never been repealed. These same sweetheart tax breaks exist in the United States for big oil even today. So I believe that they are the funders of the assassination. H.L. Hunt, who was the richest man in the world at that time, Texas oil man, went to the 1960 convention and was bitterly disappointed when John Kennedy was nominated over JFK. He tells a Johnson intimate, Madeline Brown, well, we may have lost a battle, but we haven't lost the war. On the day after Kennedy's assassination, he calls her on the phone and he says, well, I guess we won the war.
Wow. Now, is he related to E. Howard Hunt at all, by any chance?
No. The Hunts, he's related to Lamar Hunt, who in the 70s, I guess, tries to corner the market on silver. He is no longer the wealthiest family in the United States, but for most of the 50s and 60s, H.L. Hunt was a reclusive right-wing billionaire, not related to E. Howard Hunt, who also is woven through this tale. E. Howard Hunt says on his deathbed, yes, he did work for the CIA, yes, he was in Dallas the day of the assassination, and yes, LBJ was the mastermind. The KGB, we learned, conducts a full investigation. Declassified U.S. documents that became public in 1996 say that their investigation showed that Lyndon Johnson was the mastermind of the plot to kill JFK. Jackie Kennedy goes to French intelligence. She asks them, who killed my husband? They conduct an investigation. They publish their results in France. They conclude that John F. Kennedy was killed by Lyndon Johnson. Jack Ruby, when he's being pulled down a hallway in handcuffs, and the press is shouting out questions, they say, Jack, how could this happen? Ruby says, if Adlai Stevenson were vice president, this never would have happened. Reporter yells, Jack, what are you saying? What are you trying to say? Ruby, look at the man who's in there now, the man at the top, talking about Lyndon Johnson.
Of course, they would have all just thought he was crazy at that point. You know, I mean, it was so dramatic for everyone to be looking at this bruised, punch-faced, villain that everyone wanted to believe they'd captured.
Well, and the Warren Commission tells us that Jack Ruby has no known association with organized crime. I mean, that's laughable.
Mm-hmm.
Jack Ruby is a button man for the Marcello mob. He has worked for Marcello running guns to Cuba in the late 50s. He has worked in Las Vegas in a casino owned by Marcello. He runs his strip club in Dallas at the sufferance of Marcello. The notion that Ruby has no association with organized crime is a joke.
Well, Roger, this has been great. Your book is very insightful and informative. I recommend it highly. Just to close out the show, I wouldn't mind spending a little bit of time with you on your final chapter of the book, Cui Bono, Who Benefits? And you break it down quite nicely in there. It's sort of the reason, it's the weather vane for the direction of this entire book. Tell us a little bit about who benefited.
Well, let's see. Lyndon Johnson benefited. He avoided prison and became president of the United States. His financial backers in the defense industry benefited. They got the Vietnam War, which John Kennedy was seeking to withdraw us from. According to the executive order signed by Kennedy, all U.S. advisors would have been out by 1965. Thousands of lives would have been saved and multi-millions of dollars. Texas Oil benefited. There was no repeal of their sweetheart tax breaks. The CIA benefited. They got their war in Vietnam. They got a hard line against Castro. I think all of the organized crime benefited. The efforts by Robert Kennedy to crack down on the mob were ended. J. Edgar Hoover's view right into the 1960s was that there was no such thing as organized crime, that the greatest single danger to the country was domestic communism, and that to the extent that there was crime in America, it was local crime. That the Cosa Nostra, or the mafia as we know it, didn't exist. So organized crime benefited. Everybody who was in on the plot to kill Kennedy benefited, but nobody benefited more than Lyndon Baines Johnson.
And there's that famous photograph called The Wink. You're obviously familiar with that photograph.
Yeah, I mean, within seconds of Johnson being sworn in, by the way, there was no reason to swear him in. under U.S. law, the vice president becomes president automatically upon the death of the president. So the oath of office was entirely symbolic, completely legally unnecessary. It was done by Johnson to put his imprimatur on the office and also to twist the knife in Robert Kennedy. He actually calls the Attorney General and asks him to research and get him the oath, which is something he could have done through one of Kennedy's deputies, but it's his way of twisting the knife in Kennedy. And seconds after he's sworn in, Lady Bird, who was more vicious and vindictive than even LBJ, she breaks into a broad grin, and Johnson turns around and winks at one of his political cronies, Congressman Albert Watson. Watson would later go to jail for corruption. So, yes, I think it demonstrates what was on Johnson's mind the actual day. You know, we know that as Johnson's car pulled into Dealey Plaza, 3 car lengths behind behind JFK, but before the first shot was fired, Johnson ducks. He's on the floor in his car. What did he know that we didn't know? He's actually huddled around a walkie-talkie. Mm-hmm. This is according to the memoirs of Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was in the car with him, but also news photographs, and we know the exact time they were taken. You can see that Johnson's down on the floorboards. So I think that, more than anything else, points to Lyndon Johnson's prior knowledge into the murder of John Kennedy.
And what might he have had to do, Johnson, regarding the crucial piece of information here, which is the altering of the route through downtown Dallas through Dealey?
Of course, it was Lyndon Johnson who insisted that John Kennedy even go to Texas. Kennedy told Senator George Smathers, according to Smathers' memoirs, that he dreaded the trip, that Johnson was insisting that the trip was Johnson's idea. Johnson's longtime protege, Texas Governor John Connally, who had managed Johnson's Senate campaign, had been his administrative assistant in Washington, is the man who insists on the drive through Dealey Plaza. When the Kennedy White House staff objects, doesn't like the route, Connally pitches a fit and says, you tell the president he does it our way, or the invitation is rescinded and we don't want him at all. Now, having done 13 presidential trips for Ronald Reagan, I can tell you governors don't talk to presidents that way. Gubernatorial staffs don't talk to the White House staff that way. So it was Johnson who insisted on the trip to Dallas. It was Connally who insisted on the drive through Dealey Plaza. On the morning of the motorcade, Johnson goes to JFK's hotel room and tries to persuade him to let Connally ride in the vice president's car and put Johnson's archenemy, Senator Ralph Yarborough, in the death car. And JFK refuses. How do we know that? Jackie Kennedy writes about it in her memoirs. So, yes, I think the entire trip to Dallas was orchestrated by Johnson and Connally. Interestingly enough, JFK was in San Antonio and Houston on the 21st, yet Connally and Johnson had no interest in the minute logistics of that trip. But for the Dallas trip, they micromanaged every second of the president's time in Dallas.
Unbelievable and very unfortunate, but thank you so much, Roger, for coming on the show and explaining some of this to us. I wish you luck with mainstream media getting the word out. I know it's uncomfortable for a lot of people to hear things like this, but when you look at the evidence, as you have obviously done from your perspective, it's a pretty compelling case.
I appreciate the opportunity. The Man Who Killed Kennedy, the Case Against LBJ. Get it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or at my site, lbjkilledjfk.com. Many thanks.
And as well, your upcoming book signing again in Buffalo, New York at Talking Leaves will be the 6th of December, but you'll also be there. What are you doing on the 5th?
I have another book signing at the Wyndham Hotel in Amherst.
That's right, the Wyndham Hotel in Amherst.
It's actually in Williamsville at 5195 Main Street in Williamsville.
So there you go, everybody. If you're in the area, definitely take advantage of the opportunity to meet Roger and bring home one of his books. Thanks for coming on again, Roger.
Thanks for having me. Many thanks.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracy Queries with Alan Park. Please offer comments or complaints by emailing conspiracyqueries@gmail.com or on Twitter @con_queries or at our website, conspiracyqueries.com. Thanks for listening.